What?
Job is the Genesis, the story of the Genesis?
Job is technically no longer Genesis, but it's in this same little group. The Bible, as we talked about a little bit last week, is a number of different writings, sometimes explicitly called books, that get collected. And Genesis is a little bit different than Job. Job would come under, the Genesis is part of a group of writings called the Pentateuch, which is 5 books of the Bible, the first 5 books of the Bible. And Job comes in just a little bit after that. The book of Job is part of a group that they generally categorize as the wisdom literature. It's a lot of stuff that, for our purposes, we don't need to go into too much. Okay. Oh. Hi, Adelina. How are you? Yeah, that's good. Book of Job. This is in our version of it. This is it's not short, but it's not terribly long. This is pretty heavily excerpted, meaning that there's a whole lot that gets left out. With something like this, I would suggest the leaving out can be significant because it's part of an overall effect. What the full work has in its totality is a kind of, because it is considerably longer than what we have here, it's like coming up against something much larger. Certain things, when they're abbreviated, you can get the gist of it, but the full effect can only really reside in like the monumentality of something. The again, the form sometimes matters as much as, if not more than, the content. And coming up against page after page after page of all of the arguments of a central discussion like this has a kind of accumulated weight that in excerpted form you can say, well, yeah, they touch on all the highlights, but the highlights don't really carry the whole thing. So with this, and with anything that we deal with in excerpted form, and because of the limitations of this class and all of our, time, we have to deal with excerpts. It's just something to bear in mind that there's a lot of value to reading all of the other parts of it that are left out. When I talk about an awful lot of stuff, just earlier, I was talking about we're hitting all the big points, but sometimes it's what's in between that matters. What's in between that really suggests through subtler means what the whole point is. That tends to get washed away when you go to ripping out whole chunks of it and saying, yeah, you don't need that. You don't need that. So, with everything, I highly encourage everyone to go out and read the full book of Job at their convenience. I will not be checking on this. I will not be requiring you to come in and tell me about, the other arguments that Job has to wade through among his friends and his responses to them. There is a formal construction to it that is really quite extraordinary in the way the arguments intersect that you can only get in the full work, but we just don't have the time. So this is my standard suggestion that whenever we come up against anything in an excerpted form, bear in mind before you start grappling with it that you're dealing with fragmented evidence. And that can be dangerous in terms of trying to make use of it, which is what we're trying to do. Okay. Excerpts are problematic, but let's face it, we got other things to do. Okay. Adelina! Hi, once again. You notice how I touched base with you, and then just to get you sort of like,
Yeah.
and then I moved over, and it's like, oh, okay.
I know.
I'm sadistic, and I do these things to torture people. But, this has to be fun for me too, or it's just, unfair. Tell me about Job.
So the story of Job is about a prosperous man who lives in fear of God, but when God takes everything away, he questions his faith. So in the beginning of the story, it's basically talking about everything that he has, his children, his large estate, his many animals. Then it goes to God in attendance. God came to stand in attendance before the Lord and the adversary, and this adversary has been roaming the earth, and he says, I don't think that Job is living in fear. I think he's hacked the system in a way, and he's being good so he can continue to get things. So God puts it to the test and takes everything away from him, including his home, his children. Obviously, he's broken. He shaves his head, gets bare naked, and puts his body against the earth, and says he wishes he was never born, but still, he still doesn't blame God for this at this point until the adversary comes back to God and says, let's make it worse, I guess. And then he comes down and swelters his body, and he's in pain and agony, and he questions God, and he starts to wonder, does God hate him? He thinks of anything that he could have done. He can't come up with anything. His friends come and they stay for, I think it was 7 days, 7 nights. They don't speak a word to him until they say, you have to have done something. He doesn't punish the evil. Then God confronts him, which I don't think would literally happen. And he shows him how intricate the world is, and it's basically how beautiful and how much there is that he doesn't know and he can't understand, such as the two monsters. And he doesn't apologize for doing what he did. He just says, I did this and you shouldn't question me in a way. Then I guess I don't know if he felt bad or if this is just how the stars align, because he had a bigger picture which he never mentions to anyone, or it tells Job when he confronts him. He went all the way down to confront a human, and he doesn't tell him his real reason. And then he basically gives everything back. He has new children, new estate. He has even more, and he lives, I think it was 140 years. So it's the literal interpretation of what happened. This story has a lot of symbols in it. Let me start. To start, I think the three friends aren't really the way I interpret it, the three friends is really himself. So it's when you question God. Oh wait, let me get back to that. Sorry, I'm mixing everything up. So basically, Job says to God, "Can you forgive my friends?" And he says, "Oh, I'll let it go." But the fact that there was even something for them to be punished for is saying you can't question. And then you talked something about the ideology, the reason about last lecture, the reason things happen, explaining why.
Etiology.
Etiology, sorry. And then I think this story is explaining why bad things happen to good people, and it proves that God isn't just. basically like you do something good and you get good things back. It's we can take things away from you, and life is how it is, and you don't always understand it. For basically like the socio-historical point, it's your authority figure shouldn't be questioned. You should be ashamed for questioning. And then I thought it was interesting how in the end he was basically I thought about this while we were talking about the other story, like in the end when he's forgiven also, like his friends are forgiven, he's pardoned. I think that's because everyone, we are logical. We would question when things go bad, and it's basically if you do question him, you can redeem. Otherwise, everyone who questions him would just give up if they thought it would end horribly for them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sort of an asymmetrical negotiation when you're dealing with God on the other side of the table. Yeah, very good. The adversary that you speak of at the beginning, this is a problematic figure from a lot of different angles, but the adversary in Hebrew is generally the word Satan, Satan.
I was watching this video about it, and they were interpreting it as if he was Satan, and then it was very confusing because it was like in the end, like there was so many more questions besides like the three that I was trying to stick to, and it was why would God even go towards Satan light and even punish people, someone he loves and who cares about?
Yeah, here Satan is not, hanging out in hell and just ruling over his domain. Here Satan seems to have a seat at the table. He's in the room where it happens. He is God's advisor, if you will, in this, part of a council. Now, automatically, this brings up questions of, polytheism versus monotheism. Wait a minute, if God is the only God, who are these other guys? What's going on here? And yeah, this is a problematic text in that case. And there's a whole wealth of debate that we don't need to go within a country mile of. But significantly, Satan poses a question. And that is, and we'll call him the adversary because Satan is going to conjure all of these other images. The adversary poses this question of what good is it? Or you think that Job is so good, but you've given him a pretty cushy life. What does it prove that he is so pious when, it's good to be Job? How about just for, I don't know, just for giggles? What if we screw with him just a little bit? What if we turn his fate just a little? How will he react? Will he still be so nice? Will he still be so pious? We can do that, And God, presumably, caring about individuals, goes along with this. Again, the character of God is very troublesome throughout this text. And it can lead into a lot of places, but I'm going to try and steer away from that. The adversary just centers in on this one problem with the world that God has created. That you give them life and faith, and you make everything good for them because you care for them. But what does it really mean? Can they just be mouthing their loyalties and saying, yeah, God is good, yay, yay, God? And that's really easy when everything's going well. But you put it, I love this phrase, according to the adversary, Job hacked the system. Everything was set up well for him. So here we're trying to screw with that just a little bit, almost as a scientific experiment. God doesn't seem particularly bothered by the implications of what this can mean, the suffering it will cause. It's just an academic exercise. Sure, let's run this up the flagpole and see what happens. And you can argue about the morality of that, the morality of God. And that's kind of what this does. Job is suddenly basically stripped of his wealth. His family suffers. He is left destitute. And everything, all of the gifts from God are suddenly removed. And Job's reaction is, I think we can say, remarkable at first in its endurance. And he said, naked I came out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord has given, and the Lord has taken. May the Lord's name be blessed. Which is a remarkably stoic answer. Stoicism comes centuries later, but you know where I'm going with this. He accepts this fate with great equanimity. He says, Que sera, God is good. You know, it's the timeless philosophy of shit happens, what you gonna do? But he returns at the end to, may the Lord's name be blessed. So he is clinging to that faith, that fealty, that dedication to God and the idea of his goodness, even as all evidence of it is being stripped away from him. It's hard to endorse a religious belief that seems to punish you. And punish you for what? That's the crux. He can't figure out why. Bad things keep happening to him. He keeps losing more and more and more. Misery upon misery is piling up on him, and people are looking around going, what the hell? You know, what did you, Job, just between you and me, what did you do to piss God off? Seriously, God is after you. Come on, just tell me. Like, come on, it's got to be a good story. It's a good story. He can't say. His wife, Job's wife, women.
Yeah.
What does his wife say?
She basically questions it even more and tells him just throw your religion away. What I found also interesting was that the only thing he left him to have was his wife, and he still went to the ground. You would think that a wife would be enough to start up again and be happy, but it wasn't enough. Obviously I understand the children, but the land. So I thought that was interesting as well.
Yeah, she
Left him.
She is not painted very kindly here. Her portrait is somewhat negative, I think we could say. His wife said to him, do you still cling to your innocence? Curse God and die. That's actually a direct quote from my wedding vows. Curse God and die. You know, what are you holding up for? Just admit you screwed up. take that, admit it, and just admit that, yeah, you're evil at the core. And prove that by cursing God, and then, you go on and you die, and I'll go marry somebody else, and I'll be okay. And I'll get you and your dirty anti-God cooties away from me. She does not come off as a particularly sympathetic figure here. Now, as a point of dramaturgy, you can see the authors of this, casting around, well, okay, we got to have another character in here, somebody who's going to be involved, have some skin in the game, who, without getting too complicated, we got to have somebody in here to suggest this route to him so that he can turn away from it. So you can see, well, okay, the authors, they just got to have someone say, well, the wife. She's right there, she's intimately involved, and she can be that voice giving him that choice, that moment to choose this way or that way. But again, I think we can see a pattern. Job's wife, unnamed, we don't know her name. Whenever you don't have a name, you can start to think that, well, she's not really being given much credit as a human being. She's just a function, a symbolic role more than an individual one. The wife, the woman, is always the troublemaker. Ain't it always the way, huh? God resists, or Job resists. Job got difficult names, and I swear to God, I always look at this and think job, and I think it's an economics report. But then his friends come to visit. After the wife, yeah, she's important. Then the really important people come over, his buddies. And they come over and they sit him down and say, come on. What's the story? What's the problem? Just admit it. You did something. You did something. You have to have done something. Otherwise, none of this would make sense. We see all the evidence in front of us. We are drawing our conclusion. It must be this way. It's illogical to think that you couldn't have done something. God is just. Therefore, he only punishes the unjust. Therefore, if you are punished, you are unjust. It's a syllogism. It's logic. It makes total sense. Does it? Each friend brings up a different argument against it, and one after the other. And here, this kind of gets lost in the excerpted form. Each friend brings up a new argument, and Job resists it and argues against it. And what you have here then is a different form. It's no longer just because after this initial prologue, which is all written in prose, and you can see again, it just means that the text is going from border to border. Once it becomes poetry, it really simplifies into a kind of a dialogue form. A dialogue is a very ancient compositional form where it's good for relating of speeches. You have one speech that is then answered by another speech, and then that leads to either a response from the first or a branching off in a third speaker, and so on. And there's a pattern that erupts where different aspects of the argument get taken up, considered, and either developed further or dispelled one after the other. And the dialogue is an ancient form. It reaches its apex probably in Plato, in the Socratic dialogues, where these different questions of debate, where perhaps there is no ultimate answer, but it comes out in the collision of these ideas and perspectives. Some meaning can be derived from them, and you can always reevaluate how good the arguments are. This is a standard of the ancient world, probably even more so than the objective storytelling narrative of Sinaway. But you get these collisions of ideas, and it's never quite clear where an answer is, because everybody seems to have a point. And here, basic argument, everybody is given a substantial speech, one after the other. They don't just sit there and bicker at one another. These ideas are given great weight and consideration. And they argue subtleties of these points, so that by the time you get to the end of a speech, it makes perfect sense. Of course you're guilty. You did something because that is why God is punishing you. It's a logical universe. God is good. If something bad happens, that is in opposition to God. And therefore, opposition to God means you have sinned. It makes sense. It's a philosophical way of looking at the world. It's a philosophical engagement in debate that is very familiar to not ancient antiquity, like I would argue Genesis is, but Job is coming out of a somewhat later tradition of biblical culture where it was much more sophisticated. And so here you have a much more problematic world, because the God of the Pentateuch, of the Torah, of Genesis, is a little bit more straightforward. You can grasp him a little bit more. Here, the character is much more complicated. How would you characterize God in this?
He doesn't sound holy. He doesn't seem like he's fair. He doesn't feel like he's like playing games. Like if the God's gonna tease him, he's gonna say, "Oh, okay, like I guess we'll ruin his life," and then that life doesn't matter.
Yeah, this is not the fuzzy God. This is not a God who is the open arms, the embrace of the loving father figure. This is a God who's let's screw with you a little. Yeah, Satan's got a good idea. We should do this. Very few people walking around with general notions of God and Satan would say that, they could be on the same side from time to time. The notion of that is abhorrent in many religious traditions. No, God is all good. But here we have, in some of the oldest traditions of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, some of the oldest writings in that tradition saying, well, no, it's a little bit more subtle, a little bit more problematic. God can be, in this, kind of a jerk, little mean, little petty, at times quite sarcastic, which is some of my favorite parts, honestly. He rubs against easy interpretation. You can't cuddle up to him. You can't simplify him. You cannot reduce him to something in your mind. We'll jump ahead just a little bit, and then we'll come back. You said, and yeah, you were sort of funny, that at a certain point, God shows up and starts arguing his case, which you point out is unlikely. Job has been having this argument with your friends, and wouldn't it be nice if you were arguing with your friends and they're just again and again and again beating you down with all this logic that they're coming at you with, and then all of a sudden, if you could only just say, well, as my friend God here would say for my behalf, that's every lawyer's dream. But God shows up. And God sort of explains himself. On mine, we're 206, which is essentially chapter 38. And the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, which is great dramaturgy, great theater. You can imagine this on a cinematic scale, this big swirling Cecil B. DeMille weather front coming in and God emerging from the clouds. And the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, and he said, who is this who darkens counsel in words without knowledge? What does that mean? What do those words mean?
Just talk bad about me.
Yeah! I hear everything, but somehow I want you to stand up and admit that you're the ones talking trash. Again, kind of a dick move.
But did he really?
What?
Did he really say anything bad about me?
Well, here I would say God is addressing the group of them, not just Job.
Oh.
And everybody else is clearly, at different times suggesting variations on, yeah, okay, maybe God's making a mistake, but we're just going to try and put this behind us. More often than not, however, it is Job at various points, it's okay, arguing against the omniscience or omnipotence of God and saying that, there has to be something else. He is challenging the wisdom of God's judgments, of God's decisions. In words without knowledge. Now again, when you're God and you make an entrance, it's a big entrance. And presumably you've thought about that entrance. And you can say anything in the world. You can make any point in the world, any little point, and it would be significant. Why choose to raise the notion of words? Words without knowledge, moreover. Always think about this. This is a very deliberate choice. Who is this who darkens counsel in words without knowledge? Counsel here, I guess, could be God's wisdom. Maybe literally the counsel of gods that he was talking with, the adversary among them at the very beginning. Who darkens counsel in words without knowledge. Empty words. Words that mean nothing. Now, and again, here's the problem with excerpts. By this point, we have gone through, this is chapter 38. We have skipped over huge chunks of this. So by the time you reach chapter 38, you have digested a lot of words, and they all seem to be circling around, going nowhere. This vast expanse of philosophical thought and theology that's just driving you nuts, and every little puzzle seems to be leading nowhere. And what does that seem like? Words without knowledge. It's pointless. What are you doing? Your words are nothing. Significantly. First of all, God goes, one level deeper on the dickish front, saying, gird, pray, your loins like a man. God, kind of a dick. Lightning. Gird, pray your loins like a man, that I may ask you, and you can inform me. Kind of haughty, little bit of a high horse. Now, granted, if you're coming in on, a whirlwind, you know how to make an entrance. But still, this is overdoing it. This is just demeaning the people a little bit. Little bit. Where were you when I founded the earth? Tell, if you know understanding. Who fixed its measures, do you know? Or who stretched a line upon it? In what were its sockets sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together, for all the sons of God shouted for joy? Who hedged the sea in with doors when it gushed forth from the womb? When I made cloud its clothing, and thick mist its swaddling bands, I made breakers upon it my limit, and set a bolt with double doors. God's resume is very impressive. God knows how to answer an argument of empty words. He does so significantly here, I would say, not in words. What's he talking about here? What's his evidence? He created everything. What did he create specifically? What's that?
Art.
Art? Yeah.
I mean, it's like God created humans, he created everything, and here's one of his creations. Like arguing about his limitations.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't say literally in there, and I created man. There's no mention of Adam in here. What does he actually name check here that he created? Earth! The waves. When I founded the earth, when I stretched, who fixed its measures, who set measurement upon the earth, who hedged the sea in with doors, created the land. I made breakers upon it, the water. He created nature. So all of these people, all of these words without knowledge, these 37 chapters of talk about nothing, are coming up against not more language. He's not laying out an argument saying, well, I take your point, but now let's reconsider it from my perspective. He is not laying out that argument. He's saying, no, my argument is all of creation, nature. You want to see my opposing viewpoint? Nature. It's not language. It's creation. It's something more than language. It's not words without knowledge. It's knowledge without words. It is something beyond human understanding. Where were you when I created the earth? You, as humans, are nothing. I created all of reality. You can't imagine what that is. So who are you to question me? It's a fair question. You can say that, well, that's another example of him being just a little snide and sarcastic. You wouldn't be wrong. But I would say that on this point, it's fair. Who are human beings to think that they can understand the scope of God in this realm? This is the product of a later generation than Genesis and stuff like that. So they are a little bit more sophisticated. They've been having philosophical arguments for centuries now. They have some exalted, perhaps, notions of themselves and their capacity to reason through logic and come up with explanations for why things happen, why things are the way they are. What's God's response to that? Nope. You might think you know, you don't know. I am beyond you. That's a neat philosophical little notion. A notion of God, of theology, of the omniscient and omnipotent quality of a God that is completely beyond human understanding. But what is the effect of that? When that's your conception of God, what's the effect?
He can do whatever he wants.
God can do whatever he wants. God just screwed with Job's life, just on a whim. Yeah, sure, Satan, yeah, go ahead, screw with him. Yeah, I'm going to pop a beer, get some popcorn, and sit back and watch. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, God is independent of human care or agency anyway. What's that?
So it's basically saying it doesn't matter whether you're good or bad, if you will have faith or not. Like, if he wants to mess with you, he's gonna mess with you regardless.
Yeah, but I would push back on the it doesn't matter if you have faith. He's going to mess with you. He may mess with you regardless, but your role, it is implied here, is to have faith in the face of that, to submit, to accept all of God's burdens and the hostile nature of life, but to preserve your faith. Because in the end, God restores everything that he took away, and in fact adds to it.
I think this is the idea of like a blessing in disguise. Like he doesn't know what it is, but in the end he's getting more, and it's like God's testing you. Like God's testing your faith, and then in the end, like you get more than what you thought you would have, even though you went through a lot.
Maybe it is part of a, specific strategy like that. I would suggest that at the beginning, there's no mention that, when God hatches this little plan with the adversary, God doesn't carve out the contract and says, well, yeah, you screw with them, and then in the end, we're just going to give it all back anyway. That's not there. The sudden restoration comes at the very end when, again, after all of these chapters, at that point, I think it's 41 chapters of just misery and torture, suddenly everything's restored, everything's made good. It seems a little arbitrary, almost tacked on.
I don't understand why he gave it all back. Like, at first I thought maybe he felt guilty, but I don't, why else would he give everything back besides that? But I honestly,
I don't know that God would feel guilty. God feels pretty secure in his position here.
I thought at first he felt guilty, but then I was like, no, it's probably not that. So I really have no explanation besides the one of, telling people that even if you do make mistakes, you can still be redeemed so that they don't give up completely and doing work. That's the only explanation I could think of as to put that as the ending. Because if they wanted it to be God is all-powerful, they wouldn't have given it back.
Yeah. What you're touching on there is, again, a sort of hotly debated point where many scholars will point to that sudden reversal, like it's almost like a phony happy ending. It's like, Hollywood studios see a really sad movie going along there and they say, well, that doesn't work. Nobody's going to like that. Let's slap something on there. Happily ever after. That's good. That'll work. That'll make everybody feel good as they leave the theater. And there is a critical tradition of people saying that, yeah, that's not quite accurate, but, it feels like it was tacked on at a later date. And that's a pattern that you see throughout biblical literature and a lot of similar traditions where the people who wrote the beginning do not seem at all to be the people who wrote what we have as the ending. And there's an awful lot that you can dig into that, because then you're comparing these two different visions, these two different interpretations, these two different value systems that come in, and what does one say versus what the other says. And you can start to see how this plays out, because the characterizations and the realities and the consequences that come out of this, the themes, take on wildly different shapes as they go along, and they stay with us in very real ways. And this character of the unknowable, unreachable God has a long tradition in culture. We saw even in the first two books of Genesis book 1, God is this enormous amorphous being who just wills into creation everything, and he's just this bodiless force in the universe outside of nature. And then in book 2 of Genesis, God goes walking on feet, presumably, through the Garden of Eden. And he comes upon Adam and Eve and says, what have you been doing? As if he didn't know. So that character of a limitless, boundless God, or a very limited, focused, identifiable, reachable God, is a huge dynamic that runs throughout the last several centuries of tradition. In a couple of centuries after this, you're going to have, after the founding of Christianity, Augustine of Hippo is going to come along and say that God is enormous and we cannot judge him in any way. And we must submit to him. And that thread gets picked up, quite honestly, in Islam, where God is just getting a little too cozy in the tradition. And so instead of, while Christianity took God and made him human and wandered around the earth talking to people, that's just a little too in your face. We, in the Mohammedan tradition, want a God beyond us, all powerful, all knowing. So we're going to cast him up there and say that Islam, which means submission, is the proper way to worship. And then this again feeds its way into the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s, when they come around and say, God again is getting too cozy. We want a God of abstraction, a distant God. Calvinism is fed out of that. We must submit. But is that what Job is doing? Is Job submitting throughout this? No? Why do you say that?
I mean, he didn't admit. He said yes, like he did something, but he didn't say sorry or like ask for forgiveness.
He doesn't ask for forgiveness. He says, I've done nothing wrong.
Yeah.
Why am I being punished? All he's doing is asking the question. All he's doing is saying, this makes no sense. It would be very easy for him to do, as his friends and wife, to a degree, say to do, for him to just say, yeah, I guess I'm a terrible person. I guess I did something. And by admitting that, I'm a bad person, I deserve punishment, and then we can all get on with our lives because it makes sense. But the problem with Job is that it doesn't make sense. And he needs to confront that, and everybody else needs to as well. Because Job's problem is not just Job's problem. Job's problem is everyone's problem. Because is Job the only person in the world who feels like God's got it in for them? The only person who ever said, why me? That's universal. That reaches out. That's touching not just power structures, which I think are pretty easy to see how this omniscient, all-powerful, do not ask me for my rationale authority organizes the universe, but just on a human level. We want to know. This is what it means to be human in an evolved sense. At this point, we are not just looking to subsist. We're not just looking to live on, the hunter-gatherer model. Okay, I got my berries today. I can live another day. We want to know why things happen. We want to question. We want to push back the realm of this tiny little rock that we're allowed dominion over, and we want to know what is behind the mind of God. Why does this happen? It has to make sense. And think about the character of it. Is Job in this someone to emulate? Or is he a cautionary tale? All of this crap happens to him. And he keeps asking the question, why? 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 And even when God comes down and tries to shut down all the questioning, he's still talking back to God. Just imagine the theatrics of that. God comes in on the whirlwind, this enormous presence of power and authority. And why do you question me? And Job doesn't just pee his pants and curl up in the fetal position like I would. Job answers back. Job is polite and deferential, sure, but he is engaging with God. He is talking with God. So now suddenly God is not this omniscient, beyond human interaction entity. God is in a conversation with humanity. And Job never really lets go of his question, wanting to know why. He'll accept that, okay, God can do what God can do. But the text never answers the question. And in the act of asking the question, he is challenging God. Is that something we're supposed to emulate, or is that a cautionary tale? I don't know. But it positions humanity. And clearly, we are supposed to see Job as a stand-in, a symbol of all humanity. He positions humanity as that of a seeker, a questioner, somebody who wants to know, who will endure great hardships to know what's it all about. What is the mind of God? Why does bad things happen? That's what humanity is. And that's what speaks on a human level. That's why this book lives. Yes, it perpetuates certain visions of authority. It has that effect on a organized tribal structure, let's say. It has all of that, but it's speaking to what everybody on the planet feels. That sense of awe, intimidation, resentment, and curiosity. Because we all want to know. We all want an answer. And it's never given. In the end, and this might be an effect, yeah, Job gets all his stuff back. It's good to be Job again. He doesn't get an answer. his only answer is, well, have faith. Be moral, follow God. Don't presuppose that your idea of morality is as good as God's. Where were you when I created the earth? You have no idea what morality is. You've just got words without knowledge in your head. Just follow me. Do what I say, and don't try and imagine that you can get inside my head. It's powerful. Job is rebelling against that to a degree. And when he gets everything back at the end, it seems like a happily ever after moment. It seems like almost what we're going to learn when we get to the Greeks, a deus ex machina, which means God out of the machine, which means, and suddenly everything worked out and was wonderful again, and they all lived happily ever after. And that's not a resolution to the story because it doesn't tie up any of the questions. It just ends the story and tells you, nothing more to see here. Move along. But in doing that, in making it so insufficient on that level, in not resolving any of the questions that are there, you're pointing out how conspicuous they are. And maybe you're supposed to keep asking that question because it's irresolvable. But the asking of the question is a kind of act of faith in itself. Life is a process of seeking answers in this model. And we will see again and again people trying to make sense out of the world and doing it through art, through the written word, through the simple act of sitting back and reading the reality in front of them and trying to imagine what it means.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So God gives him everything back at the end, but in between, it's like he's asking question and even asking question on his authority, like why he's doing whatever he's doing. And he didn't answer, but he gave everything back. Is it to stop the questioning, like, hey, don't question my authority. I'm gonna give it back.
Yeah, in a sense, Job is bought off in the end. It's not an original observation. Lots of people have made this. The questions are still there. The unfairness of it is still there. You know, I'm a dad. I give my kids treats to shut them up all the time. If I don't want to deal with it, yeah, sure, yeah, great, go do that. That's terrific. But the question is still there. And by not engaging with the question and then just, very obviously buying him off at the end, it makes it more conspicuous that the question was not answered. So you are once again put in the place of Job, because Job can go off and live, fat and happy for whatever's left of his life. You get the sense he's kind of old, and let's face it, he's had a hard couple of years. But those questions he leaves to us as we read. And you don't get to enjoy all the riches he gets, but the questions are yours. And you perpetuate them through your own life. It's a burden. I would argue, though, that it's what it means to be human, for whatever that's worth.